Good morning, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the first edition of Capital Connection. We're broadcasting from the south wing of the Illinois State Capitol, where we will keep you connected to politics here in Illinois. Our first guest will be Governor Jim Edgar, former governor of Illinois, and he will give us some insights on how the negotiations between Governor Bruce Rauner and Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan could be going. Also, the Illinois heroin crisis. A new report identifies our state as one of the nation's worst. But an expert we'll meet has some ideas to change that. And our Reporters Roundtable will come up and close the show. We'll talk about issues including a child care chief who was reassigned after criticizing Bruce Rauner's policies on child care. All that and more coming up next on Capital Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol, this is your Capital Connection.
Well, welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Matt Porter. First, our top stories making headlines this week in Illinois. The Senate overrode Governor Bruce Rauner on Wednesday in a 35-18 split. Senate Democrats voted to let state workers seek independent arbitration in negotiations with the governor. Now, the bill allows unions to seek a third-party mediator if both sides can't reach an agreement. Unions will have to surrender their right to strike after choosing mediation, and the governor calls this bill the worst in state history. It will head to the House next. The Senate also voted to help low-income students afford college. The bill funds the Monetary Award Program by $370 million. The figure matches what the governor asked for in his budget. It is $24 million fewer than what Democrats wanted. That also heads to the House. And Secretary of State Jesse White made a surprise announcement Thursday at the State Fair. White announced this would be his final term in office. The popular politician has served as secretary since 1998. He became the longest-serving secretary last May. White's term is scheduled to end on January 2019. And both parties held individual days at the State Fair. Bruce Rauner held a campaign-style event on Wednesday. The governor had a mixed reception with several hundred protesters on hand. Democrats followed with a smaller event Thursday featuring Senate candidate Tammy Duckworth. Now, this week may have included some fun at the fair, but it certainly wasn't without major debate here at the state capitol. Up next, we'll have former Illinois Governor Jim Edgar to talk to us about the budget crisis. All this coming up on Capital Connection.
Watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Well, welcome back. Our top story tonight is the continuing gridlock here at the Capitol. Republicans and Democrats continue to blame each other for the stalemate. Meanwhile, nonprofits, state vendors, and some state services are suffering. And Governor Bruce Rauner has laid the blame on one person in particular.
Speaker Madigan pulls the strings, and so many of the legislators dance to his tune.
Well, that was Bruce Rauner just minutes after Democrats passed their budget on May 31st. Fortunately, not much has changed since. Now, I'm here with someone who knows a lot about divided government. Former Illinois Governor Jim Edgar, you were governor while Democrats controlled the legislature at points. Tell us, did you expect it to be like this when Bruce Rauner took office?
No, I really had hoped we would kind of do as we often did in the past. We would disagree, but come adjournment day, we would work out a compromise and pass a budget. Now, sometimes we took a few extra days, but this is the longest I've ever known the state to go without a budget. They've had temporary budgets, but we've got several state agencies, several groups that have not had funding since the 1st of July, and it's a problem.
Well, what do you think about the governor's tactics this summer? You know, he had those ads going for a while, obviously mailers, and then the political rhetoric when he's made speeches in front of the media.
Well, I mean, again, every governor is going to have their own style and their own approach. I found it to be much more productive when I dealt with Mike Madigan back then too, and we had our disagreements. But we tried to, particularly when we got into overtime, to cut the rhetoric and we met often. I usually had him down for lunch, and we tried to figure out how can we kind of get us both off the limb here and compromise and, get a budget passed and do what we need to do. So at least for me, I found it to be a little more productive to try to, behind the scenes, work with them and see if we can't find some area of compromise.
What happens to the legislators on the other side of the aisle when they see those ads broadcast in their districts?
Well, I'm sure they're not very happy about him. I don't think it helped move this process along. I don't think rhetoric from either side, that's particularly personal, really helps the process. I think far better, you can have your disagreements. As I always tell students, you can disagree, but disagree in an agreeable manner. And unfortunately, when you let it become personal, I think it's harder then to get people to come together and try to compromise. And that's what's going to have to happen. I mean, you have a split government, and so it's going to take both Republicans and Democrats meeting halfway to get us off the stalemate we're now in.
Well, you said just a few weeks ago on August 7th, and I'm going to quote you here, some of the things he's asking for, they're not going to give him. They're just not going to give him. What are those issues that Democrats aren't going to bend on?
Well, my assessment is I think it's going to be extremely difficult to get the Democratic legislature to pass term limits. I mean, I just don't think they're going to do that. There are certain labor issues that they won't budge on. I think there might be other things that they might meet him halfway on. But, you know, there are certain things you've got to kind of prioritize, and to me the priority is the budget. Then you also have to pick timing. We couldn't do things the first 2 years I was governor. Now we got a budget. We got a balanced budget. We got a good budget, which I thought was the most important. But some of the business reform things that we were able to get, we had to wait until we had a Republican-controlled legislature, because there's some things you're going to get the Democrats to move on, some things you aren't. Chicago school reform was another issue that we knew we weren't going to achieve when we had a Democratic-controlled legislature, but
right.
when we had a Republican, we got those done.
Well, what about Speaker Madigan? He's also maintained the same position through the summer. What's it like to try to work with him? You worked with him, you negotiated with him. What's he like?
Well, he can be very difficult. He's very closed-mouthed. I mean, he keeps things close to his chest. I mean, it's hard to know sometimes. But, you know, once you work with him and he develops a trust knowing that, you know, what you say is what you mean. I found him to be pretty easy to work with. Now, he has some strong feelings. On labor issues, I used to know we're not probably going to move him. But on budgetary issues and other issues, I could usually find a halfway point and we could reach a compromise.
Well, is he the puppet master that Bruce Rauner pointed to?
If only somebody had that kind of control in Springfield. I remember when I first came here, somebody pulled me aside and he says, you're going to hear there's people behind this scene that control everything. If only there was that much control. No, he is a very smart person. He's got a lot of influence, but he can't control the Senate. They're an independent body. His members, he can only push him so far. But he is very good at counting and knowing where his members might be and knowing how to outweight somebody. I mean, I would hate to play poker with him. But again, I think Bruce Rauner is probably a pretty good poker player too. And, you know, we're at time now when I think everybody needs to put their cards down and let's move ahead.
Well, you know, Bruce Rauner was a businessman. He certainly knows how to navigate business. Do you think part of the fact that he hasn't been in politics before is why we're, you know, kind of waiting unusually long?
Well, I think both of them. I mean, the Democrats haven't had a Republican governor to deal with. I mean, they pretty much ignored the Democratic governors and did what they wanted to do for 10 years. So they're not used to dealing with a strong governor. And for Bruce Rauner, I mean, state government is a new experience. I mean, he's smart, he's a quick learner, but they both, I think, have to adjust to the new reality. And unfortunately, it's taken a little longer than I'd hoped it would.
Well, let me ask you, do you have any estimate yourself of when you think they might come sit down?
No, I don't. I had hoped that I went off to Colorado a few weeks ago, and I'd hoped when I came back it would be all resolved, but it doesn't seem like they've made much progress. So I have no prediction. I just think that we need a budget very quickly because there are many agencies, many groups, like my alma mater, Eastern's, had to lay people off. I mean, there's some real serious problems out there for those agencies, and those groups have not received funding.
Right. Well, thank you, Governor Jim Edgar. We appreciate you coming on and being our first guest today. Well, welcome back to Capital Connection. A new state report shows Illinois is near the bottom of the list when it comes to funding for addiction services. WCIA's State House reporter Kelsey Gibbs explains why some say it needs to do more.
I've just, maintained sobriety and tried to, just work with the program.
Shayla Welsh is on the road to recovery. She made the decision to get clean.
Following what my counselor tells me, has really been amazing.
But 5 months earlier, Welsh was at the bottom of a dark hole, lost in her addiction to heroin. It's a place many others have been as well.
I was about 27 years old, and I just was, recreational using at first, here and there.
Welsh says she chose help, and that led her to Gateway Treatment Centers.
I just woke up and found myself in a vicious cycle of the addiction.
But help is becoming scarce. Between 2007 and 2012, Illinois went from 28th in the nation in funded addiction treatment. Now we're in the low 40s.
The rise of heroin and opiate addiction is on the incline. About 80% of my admissions here every day is opiate addiction.
Gateway Executive Director Carrie Henry says her center has just a few beds, but the demand for help remains high.
We have a wait list for some. It's difficult for clients to get in because of the limited services at this time.
The Roosevelt University study shows state funding has declined some 30%, while Medicaid has dipped by 4%. Less money is leaving state-funded addiction treatment centers in jeopardy.
The problems are increasing, and services need to be able to be available for people to get help. I think that's the main issue.
Welsh says the state and country needs to invest more into heroin treatment programs, because if you look at her road to recovery, you can find hope.
It's a program that really works for me, myself, and it's really been a lifesaver for me.
And with the state running short of funds, an increase in addiction funding seems unlikely. In fact, proposed budgets show deep cuts in addiction services for 2016. Now, I'm actually here with Dr. Kirk Moberg. He's the medical director for the Illinois Institute for Addiction Recovery. Dr. Moberg, has the reduction in state funding helped fuel this addiction crisis over the past few years?
Well, it only makes sense that given that addiction can be accurately portrayed as a public health crisis, that reduction in funds, which are already wanting, in essence, all over the country, would result in less people being able to get treatment and then less people having good clinical outcomes.
And so what is the state of addiction in Illinois? Is it worse than, are we worse than we were a few years ago, 5 years ago?
Yeah, the number of addicts is increasing. There was a CASA report from Columbia University on substance abuse that looked at the state of the state in addiction, and essentially we're going the wrong way. If you look at the numbers, addiction outnumbers cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in the numbers that are affected by it, but the amount of money spent on addiction is much less than any of those diseases.
Wow. And, we've heard a lot about heroin and that's a growing problem. Why is heroin becoming the drug of choice for a lot of addicts out there?
That's an interesting question. Most individuals do not get introduced to opioid drugs through heroin. But what's really troubling is that teenagers tend to introduce themselves through opioid analgesics such as OxyContin or Vicodin, for example. However, the simple economics that heroin is cheaper tends to drive that movement away from the pills to heroin at some point in the addict's life.
And addiction, once it gets started, is very difficult to stop. I mean, how often can an addict go through treatment before they finally kick the habit?
That's variable. Some people go through treatment once, others go through treatment 10 times. Addiction is a chronic, relapsing and remitting disease. It's like diabetes or hypertension, meaning that addicts have good days and that they have bad days, and relapse is part of the disease. There is an unreasonable expectation out there that someone should go through treatment once and then they should be cured. Mm-hmm. That's just based on a misunderstanding of what addiction is all about.
Why does the state need to fund addiction treatment services? I mean, I assume lots of people necessarily not having the highest incomes among this population.
Well, if one were to look at it purely from an economic perspective, The statistic that's most important is that 33% of all of hospital admissions are the result of the disease of addiction. So think of what we could do if we could treat it as its source and cut into that budget that's treating those 33% who are coming into the hospital for traumatic injuries, serious medical illnesses, even transplant services that wouldn't have to be done otherwise.
Well, and of course, if they're going to the emergency room rather than treatment, it's going to cost everybody more, right?
That's right. It's certainly much cheaper and easier, since you have specialists doing it, to detox a person in a specialized treatment center than to send them to an emergency department.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moberg. Thanks for giving us some of your time today. That was Dr. Kirk Moberg from the Illinois Institute for Addiction Recovery.
They never proposed a bill like this with Pat Clinton in office. So I think there's a measure of hypocrisy there.
Well, Democrats override the governor's veto on a bill allowing state worker unions to negotiate through an independent arbitrator. Welcome back. That's just one of our topics on our first Reporters Roundtable. I'm here with reporters who have fantastic insights when it comes to the Capitol. We have Amanda Vinicky from WCIA and Kurt Erickson, Capitol Bureau Chief for Lee Enterprises, a Central Illinois newspaper group. Now let's start with that Dale Ryder quote. Are Democrats being hypocritical on this bill?
Democrats would say no, that they're simply being reactive and precautionary because of comments that Bruce Rauner made when he was a candidate for governor. He said that he'd shut down government if need be, and referred to the time that President Ronald Reagan did with air traffic controllers. And further, they point to the negotiations. They say it's been 2 months, and the demands that AFSCME is telling them that Rauner is making just go too far. Whereas Rauner has promised that he will not do any sort of lockout of state workers. Nonetheless, AFSCME says you're going to be able to make us go on strike, basically force the hand of unionized workers because of what they call outrageous demands.
Well, Kurt, what is this arbitration that we're hearing about? How would that process work?
Both sides would have to declare an impasse, and then it would go to an independent arbitrator. Well, I'm not sure if it's one person or a three-person
I think it's a group,
panel,
like 3 or 4.
But then they would decide which of the best last offers to take. So, it would be a up or down kind of thing.
And so both sides would theoretically have to have these more conservative demands and not be so radical as currently what we're hearing.
That's what the Democrats would say, but, as Rauner put it, the arbitrators could be leaning toward the union side of things, and so they could take maybe a less conservative.
And I guess that would be why Rauner's claim this is the worst bill ever in Illinois history. Is that a bit of a hyperbole?
That's a bit of hyperbole, yes. I'm sure there
I mean,
there
to
may
us,
be a list.
although I think to him, this really is very high on his list. He was clear right as soon as he got into office that he wanted to change the structure of state government and how people are hired, how people are given raises, that he wants it to be more based on productivity, give people rewards for performance, and that may be something that he's looking to do in these negotiations. And if that's taken away from him, he says that's a huge chunk of the state budget that's gotten out of his control as the chief executive.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see as this goes to the House, not a famously conservative part of the Illinois General Assembly. Let's talk about another decision involving Rauner. Was the child care chief administrator. She was reassigned this week, a week after she called Rauner's cuts to child care devastating. What does this mean for Rauner going forward as far as how his administration would go?
I think it's an example that if you're in the Rauner administration, you toe the company line. She didn't. Maybe she didn't realize how maybe heavy-handed he can be when talking about administration business, but she quickly found out, and that was a message sent to everyone working in the administration.
And this was a chief who had worked in Republican administrations before. She had been around for 10 or 15 years. Finally, we had a big announcement at the Democrats' Day State Fair yesterday. Jesse White says he's not going to run in 2018. Amanda, what do you make of that?
He's said that before, so we'll have to wait and see. It's years away, but he is 81 years old, and he says this time you can take it to the bank. So I think we're going to see a ton of jockeying from both political sides for this position. Rauner, of course, has a ton of money that he's been willing to put in before, and this is traditionally seen as a sort of office you can use to advance to a higher level one. So you're going to find pretty much every legislator coming out of the woodwork, I'd anticipate, that wants to make a run at higher office, trying to make a grab for this one if, in fact, White does step down.
Well, and this doesn't seem to be necessarily a safe Democratic seat. The Republicans held the seat for almost 20 years before Jesse White. Kurt, what kind of people are we going to see coming out? And does the fact that it's this early, is that telling us something about the race?
I think we're going to see some people coming out of Chicago.
This is the sort of seat where when it's open, it's open.
Right.
It's for grabs, and you're going to have anybody that in the Senate perhaps doesn't have to run again. You've got already a couple of downstaters that are talking about trying to make a run for it. The Chicago machine could put their weight behind it. It's seen as a place where there's a lot of patronage opportunities, aka jobs. So I think, yes, you're going to see the change that it's so far out in advance that you've got 3 years is that people will be looking toward that and making a lot of vote decisions based on that.
We'll have to see. Well, thank you both for joining us and being our first guests on this roundtable. As for you, if you want to continue to follow Capital Connection, you can follow us on Twitter at CapConnectIL. You can also follow us all week on WCIA Channel 3 with our Capital team. And you can also go to our website, IllinoisHomepage.net, 24/7. Thank you for joining us. This has been Capital Connection. Have a great week.